The first time Laura Whitcombe lied about her name, it tasted like copper. She practiced it in her head for days as the train clattered west. Laura Hale, simple, forgettable, the sort of name a woman could tuck into her pocket like a plain handkerchief and pull out only when needed. But when the conductor asked for her ticket at the little platform outside of Abilene, Kansas, and she said, "Laura Hale, or she?" Her voice shook anyway. The man barely glanced up. He punched her ticket, tipped his cap, and moved along. Laura stood alone on the platform with her carpet bag and her pounding heart. Wind worried at the hem of her coat. The sky looked too wide to be trusted. Back east, buildings crowded the horizon, streets in brick and railings. Even danger had edges there. Here it could come from anywhere. Or worse, it could follow. She waited until the train was a thin line in the distance, and only then did she let herself breathe. A wagon passed, two boys on horseback, a woman in a plain bonnet carrying a basket. No one looked at her too long. Still, Laura's fingers stayed tight around the handle of her bag. She walked toward town because there was nothing else to do and nowhere else to go. Abilene had a main street that tried hard to look proud. False front buildings with painted signs, a livery, a general store, a boarding house that advertised hot meals like it was a miracle. It smelled like dust, horses, and coffee that had been boiled too many times. She kept her eyes forward. In her pocket was a folded sheet of paper with a name and an address in Kansas, written in careful script by the only person back east who'd ever been kind to her. Mr. Edwin Marsh, the head bookkeeper at Larkin and Smythe Shipping. He'd found her crying over a ledger late at night and had known by the color of her face and the way her hands shook that she'd seen something she shouldn't. He hadn't asked for details. He'd simply said, "You need to leave," and pushed the paper into her palm. "Who?" Laura had whispered. "A friend of my sister's," he'd said. "A woman runs a decent boarding house out west. She owes my family a favor. Go to her. Use whatever name you like. Just go." Now Laura stood in front of that boarding house, staring at the worn steps as if they might bite her. She climbed them anyway. Inside, the air was warm. A pot simmered somewhere. A woman with gray-streaked hair looked up from behind a counter. Her eyes were sharp, but not unkind. "Yes?" the woman asked. Laura swallowed. I was told to ask for Mrs. Nettie Caldwell." The woman's expression changed, only a flicker, but Laura caught it. "Who told you?" "Mr. Edwin Marsh," Laura said softly. "Boston." Mrs. Caldwell set down her pen. "You're a long way from Boston, miss." "I know." Mrs. Caldwell studied her face, then her hands, then her coat that was too fine for a Kansas platform, but too worn to be fashionable. "Name?" Laura forced the lie up again. "Laura Hale." Mrs. Caldwell held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded once, like a judge deciding whether mercy was deserved. "All right, Miss Hale," she said. "Room and meals cost money. If you don't have much, you'll work." Laura's shoulders loosened by a fraction. "I can work." "I expect you can," Mrs. Caldwell said. "You look like you've been working since you were 12. Laura's mouth twitched, almost a smile. Almost. Mrs. Caldwell leaned forward. "Are you in trouble?" Laura hesitated. Mrs. Caldwell didn't press. She simply said, "All right, you don't have to tell me, but if trouble comes to my door, I need to know whether it's the kind I can chase off with a broom or the kind that comes with guns." Laura's heart kicked hard. "It's not the broom kind," Laura admitted. Mrs. Caldwell sighed and came around the counter. She touched Laura's shoulder, firm and brief, like a mother checking a fever. "Then you'll keep your head down," she said. "You'll be polite. You'll be smart. And you'll remember something, Miss Hale." Laura looked up. "In a town like this," Mrs. Caldwell said, "folks notice strangers, but they also protect what they decide belongs to them." Laura didn't know how to answer, so she nodded. Mrs. Caldwell led her upstairs. The room was small but clean. A narrow bed, a wash basin, a window that looked out into a backyard where chickens scratched in the dirt. Laura set her bag down, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the floorboards until her breathing evened out. Then she opened her bag and took out the one thing she'd carried that wasn't clothing or practical: a photograph. Her family, posed stiffly in front of their Boston home, father with his stern mouth, Mother with her careful smile. Laura herself, younger, brighter, unaware of how quickly a life could change shape. She traced her mother's face with her fingertip. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though she wasn't sure who she was apologizing to. Outside, the wind shifted. Somewhere in town, someone laughed. It sounded far away. Laura took work in Mrs. Caldwell's kitchen and, when needed, in the small laundry room out back. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest, and it gave her an excuse to keep her hands busy. Busy hands didn't shake as much. On her third day, Mrs. Caldwell sent her to fetch flour from the general store with a short list. "Don't let Mr. Griggs talk you into buying his fresh apples," she warned. "They're fresh in the sense that they were once alive." Laura tucked the list into her pocket and walked down the street with her head lowered. The general store bell chimed when she entered. The smell of molasses and leather and soap wrapped around her. Mr. Griggs was a broad man with a thinning head of hair and a voice built for gossip. "Mornin'," he boomed. "You must be the new girl staying with Nettie." Laura made her face blank. "Yes, sir." He eyed her. "Name?" "Laura Hale." "Hale," he repeated like he could taste whether it was real. Then he shrugged. "Well, welcome. You here for flour?" "Yes." She waited while he measured it out. While she waited, the door opened again. A man stepped inside. Laura didn't look at men anymore the way she used to. Back east, she'd been taught to glance, smile, move along. Now she cataloged them like threats. Height, build, hands, eyes, boots. The way they carried themselves. This one was tall, lean, with sun-browned skin and dark hair that curled slightly at the ends, refusing to behave. His shirt was clean, but faded from too many washings. His boots were scuffed. Honest work boots, not polished city ones. He paused just inside the doorway, as if the noise of town pressed against him. "Afternoon, Theodore," Mr. Griggs called. The man nodded. "Afternoon." His voice was low, quiet, like he didn't use it unless necessary. Mr. Griggs leaned on the counter. "You're late this month. Thought the coyotes finally got you." "They tried," Theodore said, deadpan. Laura looked up before she could stop herself. Theodore's eyes met hers for a second, dark, steady, tired. Not hungry, not cruel, just weighed down. He gave a polite nod and looked away, turning his attention to a list in his hand. Mr. Griggs bustled. "Need feed? Nails? Kerosene? I got a new shipment of—" "Just what's on the list," Theodore said. Mr. Griggs sighed dramatically, like Theodore was personally killing the joy of commerce. While Mr. Griggs gathered supplies, Theodore stood nearby, hands loosely at his sides. Not fidgeting, not posturing, not trying to be noticed. Laura realized she was staring and looked down quickly. Mr. Griggs slid her flour across the counter. "That'll be—" Before she could reach for her small coin purse, Theodore stepped forward. "Put it on my account," he said. Laura blinked. "Oh, no, sir. I can pay." Theodore glanced at her, then at the flour bag that looked heavy for her. "I'm not buying it," he said. "I'm making sure it gets back to Nettie's without you being bothered." Laura froze. Mr. Griggs chuckled. "You hear that, girl? Theodore Blackstone thinks you might get bothered." Heat rose in Laura's face, partly embarrassment, partly alarm. "I can carry flour." "I'm sure you can," Theodore said. "That's not what I said." Mr. Griggs grinned like this was the best entertainment he'd had all week. Theodore's gaze flicked to him. "Don't make it into something it isn't." Mr. Griggs held up his hands. All right, all right." Theodore picked up the flour bag as if it weighed nothing. Laura hesitated, then took her other items. They stepped outside into bright sunlight. Laura kept a careful distance as they walked. Theodore didn't try to close it. After a few moments, he said, "You're new." Laura's stomach tightened. "Yes." "You from back east?" Her steps almost faltered. She forced them steady. "Yes." He didn't ask where, just nodded once. They reached the boarding house steps. Theodore set the flour down gently, like it mattered. Laura looked at his hands. Calloused, strong, not the hands of someone who'd spent his life in a counting room like the men she'd fled. "Thank you," she said quietly. He looked up. "You're welcome." Then, as if something occurred to him, he added, "Nettie, she's a good woman. If you need anything, you can tell her." Laura's throat tightened. "Yes." He stepped back, adjusting his hat brim. "Take care, Miss Hale." The way he said her assumed name didn't feel accusing. It felt like he was offering her the dignity of being believed. When he turned and walked away, Laura watched him until he disappeared down the street. Mrs. Caldwell opened the door. "He bring the flower?" "Yes." Mrs. Caldwell's eyes followed Theodore's retreating back. "That boy's got a quiet heart. Too quiet. Sometimes I think the loneliness sits on his shoulders like snow." Laura swallowed. "Who is he?" Mrs. Caldwell snorted. "Theodore Blackstone. Runs the Blackstone Ranch out near the creek. His daddy died years ago, his mama not long after. Place is struggling." Laura looked down at the flower bag, then back at the street. She didn't know why she cared, but she did. A week passed. Laura settled into patterns. Work, meals, polite conversation with boarders who asked too many questions and then lost interest when she gave too little. She smiled when required. She kept her eyes sharp. She listened. Abilene had its own kinds of trouble, but it wasn't the kind she'd fled. Here, trouble wore spurs and sometimes smelled like whiskey, but it was familiar trouble, local trouble. Then, on a Friday afternoon, Mrs. Caldwell pulled Laura aside. "You've got visitors," she said. Laura's stomach dropped so fast it made her dizzy. "What?" Mrs. Caldwell's face was hard. "Two men downstairs. They asked for a young woman came in from Boston." Laura couldn't breathe. Mrs. Caldwell grabbed her elbow. "Listen to me. You're going out the back." Now, I'll go." Laura's hands went cold. "Did you tell them my name?" Mrs. Caldwell's eyes flashed. "No, I told them to sit and wait while I checked my rooms. And then I came upstairs." Laura swallowed bile. "They found me?" Mrs. Caldwell tightened her grip. "Not yet." Laura's mind raced. She could run, but the prairie was wide and forgiving only to people who knew it. She could hide, but in a boarding house there were only so many places a person could fit. She could fight, but she was 20, and those men were those men. Mrs. Caldwell opened the back door and shoved a small sack into Laura's hands. "Food, water, my husband's old revolver." Laura stared at it. "You know how to use it?" Laura's voice shook. "No," Mrs. Caldwell swore under her breath. "All right, you point it, you pull the trigger. It'll do the rest." Laura's throat closed. "Mrs. Caldwell." "Nettie," she corrected. "If you make it through this, you call me Nettie." Laura wanted to hug her. She wanted to sob. Instead, she nodded because time was running out. She slipped out into the backyard, ducking behind the shed, and then moved fast toward the open land behind the property. The wind whipped her hair loose. Dust stung her eyes. Behind her, she heard the front door open. Voices. A man laughing. Laura ran. She didn't stop until her lungs burned and the town was smaller behind her. She kept to low ground, crouching behind scrub, moving like a hunted thing. Only when the sun dipped low did she slow, and that's when she heard hoofbeats. Her heart lurched. She pulled the revolver from the sack with shaking hands and turned. A rider crested the small rise ahead. Theodore Blackstone. He reined in fast when he saw her, concern sharpening his face. "Miss Hale?" Laura's vision blurred. Why are you? Greg said Nettie sent you out the back," he said. "Said two men were asking questions." Laura's knees nearly buckled with relief and terror combined. "They're looking for me." Theodore studied her face. "I figured." "You figured?" she echoed, half hysterical. His jaw tightened. "Folks don't run this hard unless something's chasing them." Laura hugged the sack to her chest. "I can't go back." "I didn't come to take you back," he said. She stared at him. "Why?" Theodore looked away for a moment, like the answer sat somewhere uncomfortable. Then he said, "Because you look like someone who deserved a chance to breathe." Laura's throat tightened. "I don't even know you." "You don't have to," he said. "You just have to decide if you trust me more than you trust whatever's behind you." Laura thought of the men downstairs, the way their voices had probably sounded pleasant, while their intentions weren't. She thought of the way the door to her room had been tested back east, slow, patient, like a predator's tongue. She looked at Theodore again, at his tired eyes, his steady hands. "I don't have other choices," she whispered. Theodore nodded once. "Then get up behind me." Laura hesitated. "Where are we going?" "My ranch," he said. "It's far enough out that they won't stumble on it unless they know where to look." "And if they do know?" Theodore's mouth went grim. Then we'll deal with it. Deal with it how? He glanced at the revolver in her hands. With that, if we have to. Laura swallowed hard. Theodore held out a hand. Come on. She took it. His fingers were warm, solid, real. When he pulled her up and settled her behind him on the saddle, Laura's cheek hovered inches from his shoulder. She could smell sun and leather and the faint, clean scent of soap. She didn't cling to him at first. Pride fought panic. Then the horse stepped forward and the ground shifted beneath her, and she had no choice. Her hands tightened around his waist. Theodore didn't comment. They rode into the growing dusk. The Blackstone Ranch wasn't a grand spread with white fences and manicured fields. It was stubborn, like its owner. A modest house, a barn that had seen better years. Fences patched more times than they had been built. Fields that looked like they'd fought the sun and lost, then got up and tried again. When they arrived, the house was dark. Theodore swung down first, then helped Laura dismount like she mattered. Inside, he said. Laura followed him up the porch steps. Her legs shook from the ride. Inside, the house smelled like coffee grounds, dust, and wood smoke. It was tidy but sparse, the way a place looks when someone lives in it but doesn't decorate it with joy. Theodore lit a lamp, then turned to face her. Sit, he said, gesturing to a chair at the small kitchen table. Laura sat, keeping the sack close. The revolver lay on the table like an accusation. Theodore poured water into a tin cup and slid it to her. Drink. She drank. Her hands were still trembling. When she set the cup down, Theodore sat across from her. All right, he said, tell me what you can. I don't need every detail, but I need enough to know what kind of danger I've brought to my door. Laura's throat tightened. She stared at the table. I worked for a shipping company. I was a clerk. Theodore waited. I saw discrepancies, she continued. Numbers that didn't add up. Cargo that was listed one way and arrived another. Payments made under names that weren't real. Theodore's gaze sharpened. Smuggling. Laura nodded. Maybe, or something worse. What did you do? I didn't do anything, she said quickly. That's the problem. I didn't report it. I didn't tell anyone. I just noticed. And they noticed you noticing, Theodore said. Yes, he leaned back slightly, exhaling. Do they think you have proof? Laura's voice dropped. They think I copied something, or that I can identify names. Theodore's jaw tightened. Do you? Laura hesitated. Theodore's eyes held hers, steady, not demanding, just honest. I remember some names, she admitted. I didn't write them down. I swear I didn't. But I read them so many times, I can't forget. Theodore nodded slowly. That's enough, Laura swallowed. A man came to my boarding house back east. He said he wanted to ask questions. He smiled. He called me miss, like it meant something. Then that night, someone tried my door. Her voice broke. I ran the next morning. Theodore's face went hard in a quiet way. And those men in town, they're the same ones. I don't know, Laura whispered, but they looked like them, like they belonged to the same world. Theodore stood and walked to the window, peering out at the dark land as if he could see trouble through it. After a moment, he said, You can stay here. Laura's breath caught. Just like that? Theodore turned. I'm not sending you back to them. But, Laura's hands tightened. What do you get out of it? Theodore's mouth twitched, humorless. I get another person in this house besides me. Laura's chest ached at the simple truth of it. Theodore pointed toward a narrow hallway. There's a room that used to be my mother's sewing room. It's got a bed. You can sleep there. Laura stood slowly. Thank you. He hesitated, then added, You'll have to work. Ranch doesn't run on kindness. Laura nodded. I can work. I figured, he said, and something softened in his eyes. As he led her down the hall, Laura glanced at the walls. There were no photographs, no cheerful clutter, just clean emptiness. The place feels, she searched for the word. Quiet? Theodore offered. Lonely, she said before she could stop herself. Theodore paused, hand on the doorframe. For a moment, the lamplight caught his face and made him look younger. Less like a man carved by duty, more like a boy who'd grown up too fast. Yeah, he said simply. It is. He opened the sewing room door. The room was plain, a bed, a small dresser, a chair, and a table by the window, where a sewing machine sat under a cloth like it had been put away carefully and never retrieved. Laura touched the cloth lightly. Your mother sewed? Theodore's jaw tightened. She could make a coat last 10 years. She could patch anything. Laura looked at him. What happened to her? Theodore's eyes went distant. Pneumonia. One winter that wouldn't end. I'm sorry. He nodded once. My father, he died in a fall. Horse spooked, dragged him, broke his neck. Laura's stomach turned. How old were you? 17. And you stayed? Theodore's eyes met hers. Someone had to. Laura understood that kind of sentence, not because she'd lost her family the same way, but because she'd watched her own mother shrink under her father's expectations until she barely existed. Someone had to. Those words built cages. Theodore cleared his throat. Get some sleep. Laura nodded. He turned to leave, then paused at the doorway. If you hear anything tonight, he said, you wake me. Where do you sleep? In the next room, he said. I don't sleep much anyway. Then he left. Laura closed the door and leaned her forehead against it for a long moment. She was still terrified, but for the first time in months, she wasn't alone. Morning at the ranch came early and without apology. Laura woke to the sound of Theodore moving through the house like he was trying not to disturb her. She sat up, startled to realize she'd slept deeply enough to dream. That alone made her eyes sting. She dressed quickly and stepped into the kitchen to find Theodore making coffee. He glanced at her, then back to the pot. You hungry? Yes, Laura said, because her stomach growled loud enough to answer for her. He cracked eggs into a pan and slid biscuits from a tin. The meal was simple but filling. They ate mostly in silence. It wasn't awkward exactly. It was careful. Like both of them had lived too long in places where words could be used against you. After breakfast, Theodore handed her a worn apron. If you don't mind, he said, I could use help with mending and the accounts. Laura blinked. Accounts? He nodded toward a ledger on a shelf. I'm no good with numbers. Laura almost smiled. Most men say that and mean they don't like them. Theodore's eyes flicked to hers. No, I mean I'm no good. I can count cattle. I can count fence posts. But when it comes to, money, I always feel like I'm guessing. Laura hesitated. I can help. Theodore nodded once like he'd expected that. They spent the morning working separately. Theodore outside. Laura inside cleaning and taking stock of supplies. When she finally opened the ledger, her hands stilled. The books weren't just messy. They were bleeding. She saw it immediately. Interest climbing on a loan, payments irregular, supplies bought on credit at terrible rates, a note about drought loss, another about a broken plow. The ranch wasn't just struggling, it was sinking. Theodore came in near noon, sweat dampening his hair. He washed his hands at the basin and glanced at her. You look like you found something. Laura hesitated, then turned the ledger toward him. You're paying too much on this loan. Theodore frowned. It's what they told me. Who? The bank in town, he said. Laura's mouth went tight. They're charging you like you're late even when you're not. And you're buying feed on credit from Griggs instead of paying cash when you have it. That's costing you more than you realize. Theodore stared at the ledger like it had betrayed him. I didn't know. I know, Laura said softly. That's why it's happening. His jaw worked. So what do I do? Laura looked at him, seeing something underneath the tiredness. Pride and fear. First, she said, you stop letting people assume you don't understand. You do understand. You just haven't been taught how to argue. Theodore's eyes narrowed slightly. You like arguing? Laura surprised herself with the truth. No, but I like surviving. That earned her a small, real smile from him, the first she'd seen. All right, he said, teach me. So she did. In the evenings after chores, Laura sat with Theodore at the kitchen table and explained interest and payments and how small numbers could pile up like snow until a roof collapsed. Theodore listened like it mattered, like she mattered, and in return, he taught her the ranch. He showed her how to hold a hammer so it didn't jar her wrist, how to watch the sky for weather signs, how to pour water into a trough without spooking the animals. One afternoon, they repaired a fence together. Laura wrestled with a post, gritting her teeth. It won't go. Theodore watched her for a moment, then stepped closer. Move. I've got it, she snapped. Because pride was a habit she didn't know how to put down. Theodore didn't retreat. He simply reached around her, placing his hands over hers on the post. His body was warm behind her. Solid. Angle it, he murmured near her ear. Not straight, like this. Laura's breath caught. The post slid into place. She stepped away quickly, cheeks hot. Thank you. Theodore didn't tease. He just nodded as if he understood the strange tightness in her voice. Later that night, after they'd eaten, Laura found Theodore sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the dark land. She hesitated, then sat beside him. For a while, they listened to crickets and distant cattle. Finally, Theodore said, You ever miss it? The city? Laura's laugh was short and bitter. No, Theodore glanced at her. Laura stared out into the darkness. I miss the idea of being safe without thinking about it. I miss walking down a street without planning escape routes. Theodore nodded slowly. Yeah, Laura looked at him. What about you? Do you ever wish you'd left? Theodore's eyes didn't move from the horizon. Sometimes. When my father died, I thought I could go to Wichita. Or farther. I had an uncle who offered. Why didn't you? Theodore's voice went rough. Because my mother was still alive and she was tired. She needed help, and after she died, he swallowed. After she died, it felt like leaving would be admitting it was all for nothing. Laura's chest ached. It wasn't for nothing. Theodore's mouth tightened. Feels like it sometimes. Laura didn't know what to say, so she said the only honest thing. It might still be something. Theodore turned his head toward her. His gaze held hers, steady and searching. You really believe that? Laura hesitated, then nodded. I do, she said. Theodore looked away again, but his shoulders eased slightly, like the words had made something lighter. Laura sat beside him until the stars came out fully, and when she finally went to bed, she realized something quietly dangerous. She was beginning to care whether Theodore Blackstone made it. It wasn't long before Abilene noticed Laura again. A ranch is isolated, but it isn't invisible. Theodore had to go into town for supplies, and sometimes Laura went with him, partly because it was safer together, and partly because Theodore seemed less weighed down when she was near. The first time she stepped into the general store with Theodore at her side, Mr. Griggs raised his eyebrows. Well now, he drawled. Didn't expect to see you again, Miss Hale. Nettie said you left in a hurry. Laura kept her face calm. I found work. Theodore's jaw tightened. She's working for me. Mr. Griggs' grin widened. Is that so? Theodore, you always did have surprises in you. Theodore ignored him. As they gathered supplies, Laura noticed the way townsfolk looked at Theodore, some with pity, some with calculation. And then there was the banker. Mr. Hollis kept his office tidy and his smile sharp. He stepped out onto the boardwalk when he saw Theodore. Blackstone, he called. We should talk. Theodore's shoulders stiffened. Laura's fingers curled around the ledger notes she'd kept in her pocket. Theodore started forward, then hesitated. His gaze flicked to Laura, just briefly, as if asking, Now? Laura nodded once. They walked into the bank. Mr. Hollis's office smelled like ink and polished wood. He sat behind his desk, folding his hands as if he'd been waiting for this moment. You're late on your payment, Hollis said. Theodore's jaw flexed. No, I'm not. Hollis's smile didn't change. My records say otherwise. Laura stepped forward before Theodore could speak. Her heart hammered, but she kept her voice steady. Your records are wrong, she said. Hollis's eyes flicked to her, surprised. And you are? Laura held his gaze. Someone who can read a ledger. Hollis's smile tightened. This is business between the bank and Mr. Blackstone. Laura's pulse thundered. Then you'll have no trouble explaining why you charged him late fees on weeks he paid on time. Hollis's expression shifted, just slightly, like a mask slipping. Theodore stared at Laura, shock and something else in his eyes. Respect, maybe. Hollis leaned back. Are you accusing me of wrongdoing, miss? Laura's fingers went cold. The words dangerous men flickered in her mind, but she didn't look away. I'm accusing you of taking advantage of a man who's been too busy trying to keep his ranch alive to notice, she said. Theodore inhaled sharply. Hollis's eyes narrowed. Careful. Laura's stomach rolled, but she kept going. You want your money, fine. We'll pay the correct amount, but we'll not pay 1 cent more than the contract allows. Hollis's smile turned thin as paper. And if I refuse? Laura looked at Theodore. Then we take the contract to the circuit judge. We show him your records. Theodore blinked as if the idea of fighting back had never occurred to him in full color. Hollis held Laura's gaze for a long moment. Then he picked up a paper from his desk and slid it across. "Fine," he said. "We'll adjust." Laura's hands shook as she took it, but she didn't let it show in her face. They left the bank in silence. Outside, Theodore stopped on the boardwalk, staring down at the street as if it had changed shape. "Where'd you learn to do that?" he asked quietly. Laura's laugh was brittle. "Back east, if you didn't speak up, people ate you alive." Theodore looked at her. "You weren't scared?" Laura hesitated. Then she said the truth. "I was terrified, but I was more terrified of watching you lose everything because you were too kind to fight." Theodore's throat moved. He looked away, jaw tight. After a moment, he said, "No one's ever fought for me like that." Laura's chest tightened. "You've been fighting your whole life." Theodore shook his head. "Not like that." He glanced at her again, and for a moment the space between them felt charged, like a summer storm gathering. Then Mr. Griggs called from across the street, breaking it. "Hey, Theodore, you better keep that girl around. She's got more teeth than you do." Theodore's mouth tightened. "Ignore him." Laura's lips twitched. But that night back at the ranch, when Theodore set 2 cups of coffee on the table, he paused behind her chair. "Thank you," he said low. Laura looked up at him. Theodore's hand rested briefly on the back of her chair, not quite touching her shoulder. "I don't know what I'm doing half the time," he admitted. Laura's voice softened. "Neither do I." Theodore's gaze held hers. "Yeah," he murmured. "But you keep standing anyway." Laura looked down because if she looked too long, she might do something reckless, like lean into that hand. A month passed with no sign of the men. Laura almost began to believe they'd lost her trail. Almost. Then, late one afternoon, Theodore rode in from checking the far fence line with a tightness in his shoulders. "Someone was out near the creek," he said. Laura's blood went cold. "A ranch hand?" Theodore shook his head. "No prints like ours, and someone left a cigarette butt." Laura stared at him. "You don't smoke?" "No." Laura's hands went numb. "They found us." Theodore set his hat on the table too carefully. "Maybe, or maybe it's someone else." Laura's voice went thin. "It's them." Theodore was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Tell me their names." Laura hesitated. Theodore's eyes were steady. "If they come here, I need to know what we're dealing with." Laura swallowed. "I don't know all of them. But the man who spoke to me, his name was Mr. Carraway." Theodore frowned. "Never heard it." "He didn't look like a man who works for anyone," Laura whispered. "He looked like a man who owns people." Theodore's jaw tightened so hard it made a muscle jump. Laura went on, words spilling now. "I remember other names in the ledger. Not all, but there was a H. Voss and a Gideon Hart and something about a warehouse in New York." Theodore absorbed it, face darkening. "Why didn't you report it?" he asked. Laura flinched. "Because I didn't know who to trust." Theodore nodded, surprisingly gentle. "Fair." Laura's voice cracked. "And because my father—" Theodore's eyes flicked to hers. "Your father what?" Laura swallowed hard. She'd avoided talking about her family because it hurt too much and because the truth of them didn't feel like comfort. But Theodore had shared his, and something about the way he'd said someone had to told her he might understand. "My father was a respectable man in Boston," Laura said quietly. "A church-going man, a man who shook hands with politicians." Theodore listened without moving. "And he believed," Laura continued, "that women were meant to be ornaments. Polite, quiet, useful only in the ways he approved." The words tasted bitter. "My mother used to paint," she added, surprising herself. "Before she married him." She stopped after. "He didn't forbid it exactly. He just made her feel foolish for wanting anything." Theodore's gaze softened. Laura's throat tightened. "When I got the clerk job, he said it was embarrassing. He said no man would want a wife who spent her days with numbers." Theodore made a low sound like anger restrained. Laura looked down at her hands. "When the ledger trouble started, I thought about telling my father. I thought maybe his influence could help." She laughed once, without humor. "Then I remembered how he looks at me when I speak too loudly, like I'm disobedient furniture." Theodore's voice was quiet and rough. So you ran. Laura nodded, blinking fast. My mother cried when I left. She gave me her locket. She told me she was proud. Laura's breath hitched. She'd never said that before, she whispered. Theodore's chair scraped as he stood. For a moment, Laura thought he was leaving, giving her space. Instead, he came around the table slowly and stopped beside her. He didn't touch her right away. Then gently he laid his hand on her shoulder. Laura froze, then sagged slightly under the weight of it, like her body recognized safety even when her mind couldn't. You didn't do wrong, Theodore said. Laura's eyes burned. I feel like everything I touch breaks. Theodore's hand tightened slightly. No, he said firmly. You touched my ranch and it's still standing. Laura laughed through tears, shaking her head. That's because you're holding it up. Theodore crouched slightly to meet her gaze. His eyes were serious. I'm tired, Laura, he said, and it was the first time he'd said her name without Miss Hale, without distance, without just Laura. Her heart stumbled. I'm tired of fighting alone, he continued, and I'm tired of being the kind of man people can take from because they think he won't bite. Laura's voice trembled. Then bite. Theodore's mouth twitched at that, almost a smile. I might, he said. His hand slid from her shoulder to her upper arm, careful, as if he was checking whether she'd pull away. Laura didn't. They held each other's gaze, and something unspoken rose between them, something warm, frightening, and real. Then Theodore exhaled and stepped back, like he'd pulled himself away from the edge of something too soon. I'm going to town tomorrow, he said, voice rougher. I'm going to talk to the sheriff. Laura's stomach tightened. Sheriff might not help. Theodore's eyes went hard. Then I'll find someone who will. Laura stared at him, realizing suddenly that Theodore Blackstone was changing. Not into a different man, into the man he'd always been, under the weight. And for the first time since leaving Boston, Laura felt a fierce, reckless hope. Sheriff Harlan was a thick-shouldered man with a lined face and the steady eyes of someone who'd seen too many bad outcomes to be easily surprised. He listened while Theodore spoke, then leaned back in his chair. You're telling me, Harlan said, that two strangers came asking after a woman who may or may not be your hired hand, and you think they're connected to a shipping crime ring back east. Theodore's jaw clenched. Yes, Harlan's gaze moved to Laura. And you? You got anything to say? Laura's mouth was dry. Only that I don't want anyone hurt because of me. Harlan's expression softened slightly. That ship sailed when those men started asking after you. Laura's fingers tightened in her lap. Harlan drummed his fingers on the desk. You got proof? Laura hesitated. Not written proof. I remember names. Transactions. Harlan frowned. Memory doesn't hold up in court. Theodore leaned forward. Then what do we do? Harlan sighed. We do what we can. I can keep an eye out. I can ask questions. But I'm one man. If these fellas are what you say they are, they're not just trouble. They're organized trouble. Laura swallowed. They hurt people. Harlan studied her face for a long moment. You look like you've already survived them once, he said quietly. Laura's throat tightened. Harlan stood and walked to the window, staring out at the street. All right, he said finally. Here's what we're going to do. He turned back. You stay out at that ranch. You don't go walking alone in town. You don't tell folks where you came from. And Blackstone, Theodore straightened. You make friends, Harlan said bluntly. Theodore blinked. What? Harlan's mouth twitched. You heard me. You've been out there like a hermit since your folks died. Folks like you, but they don't know you. If trouble comes, you want the town on your side, not shrugging like you're some quiet stranger who keeps to himself. Theodore's jaw flexed. I don't like people, Harlan supplied. Tough. You want protection? You build roots. Laura watched Theodore's face, the resistance there, then the reluctant understanding. Harlan sat again. There's also a man named Silas Crowder, he said. Runs a big spread south of you. He's got his hands in too many pieces. I've suspected him of leaning on smaller ranchers. If your ranch is struggling and you've suddenly got a sharp-eyed woman helping your books, he might decide you're worth pressing. Theodore's face darkened. He's been circling. Harlan nodded. Then you've got two problems. The men from back east and the men from right here. Laura's stomach tightened. Harlan pointed at Theodore. You come to me the minute you see anything. And you, his finger shifted to Laura, you write down every name you remember. Everything. Even if it's messy, it's better than nothing. Laura nodded, throat tight. As they stood to leave, Harlan's voice softened slightly. Miss Hale. Laura flinched at the name. Harlan's gaze flicked to her face, sharp enough to read the reaction. He didn't comment, he just said, whatever your name is, you don't deserve to be hunted. Laura swallowed. Thank you. Outside the office, Theodore walked beside her down the boardwalk. You all right? He asked. Laura forced a nod. Yes. Theodore's voice was quiet. If you want to leave, if you want to go farther west, I'd understand. Laura stopped walking. Theodore halted too, turning toward her. Laura's heart hammered. Do you want me to leave? Theodore's jaw tightened, eyes searching hers. No. The word came out too fast, too honest. Laura's breath caught. Theodore exhaled slowly, like he'd just revealed something he hadn't meant to. But I'm not going to keep you here out of selfishness. Laura stepped closer, lowering her voice. Theodore, I'm not staying because I have nowhere else. His eyes flicked over her face as if he didn't want to hope too much. I'm staying, she said softly, because I want to. Theodore went still. The street noise around them seemed to fade. For a moment, he looked like he might reach for her. Then he didn't. Instead, he nodded once. Rough. Right? And they walked on. But Laura could feel the unspoken thing between them, like a thread pulled tight. Silas Crowder came to the Blackstone Ranch in the middle of the afternoon, riding a glossy bay horse and wearing a smile that didn't belong on a good man. Laura saw him first from the kitchen window. Company, she said. Theodore stepped up beside her, eyes narrowing. Crowder. Crowder dismounted like he owned the ground, tied his horse without asking, and strolled up to the porch. Theodore, he called. Heard you've got help these days. Theodore stepped outside, keeping his posture neutral. Laura followed, staying a half step behind him. Crowder's gaze landed on Laura and lingered too long. Well now, he said, you've been hiding a pretty secret, Blackstone. Theodore's voice went cold. This is Laura. She works here. Crowder's smile widened. Laura what? Laura kept her face calm. Hale. Crowder tilted his head. Hale, that's a nice name, East name. Laura's stomach twisted. Theodore's jaw tightened. What do you want, Crowder? Crowder sighed, feigning hurt. Straight to business. Fine, I'll be plain. He leaned on the porch post like it belonged to him. Your loan's getting heavy. I know Hollis. I know his appetite. And I know you're behind. Theodore's eyes narrowed. I'm not behind. Crowder lifted his brows. Not yet, but you will be. Drought, repairs, feed. You're one bad season away from losing that place. Laura felt Theodore's tension beside her like heat. Crowder smiled. So here's my offer. I buy your south pasture, pay you enough to settle your loan and give you breathing room. Theodore's voice was clipped. No. Crowder's smile didn't change. Now, Theodore, don't be stubborn. That pasture's half useless anyway. It's my land. Crowder's eyes glittered. You're young. You could start over somewhere else. Theodore's mouth tightened. Not interested. Crowder's gaze slid to Laura again, slow. Maybe your little bookkeeper here will convince you. She looks practical. Laura's pulse thudded. She lifted her chin. Practical doesn't mean desperate. Crowder chuckled. Oh, I like her. Theodore, she's got spirit. Theodore's voice dropped lower. Leave. For the first time, Crowder's smile sharpened into something less pleasant. You're making an enemy you can't afford. Theodore stepped forward one pace. I already have enemies. Crowder's gaze held his, then flicked briefly to Laura's face, lingering. All right, Crowder said, still smiling. Think on it. Offers don't stay generous forever. He tipped his hat to Laura. Miss Hale. Then he walked back to his horse, mounted, and rode off, leaving dust behind him like a threat. When he was gone, Laura let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Theodore's hands were clenched. He'll come back, Laura said quietly. Theodore's voice was rough. I know. Laura looked at him. And he'll use whatever he can. Theodore's jaw flexed. Yeah. Laura's voice softened. Including me. Theodore turned toward her sharply. No. Laura held his gaze. Theodore, men like Crowder don't see women as people. He sees a lever. Theodore's face went hard. Then he'll find out what happens when he pulls. Laura's stomach twisted with fear, but something in her chest warmed too, because for all Theodore's quietness, there was steel in him when it mattered. Laura reached out before she could stop herself and touched his arm. Theodore went still, then looked down at her hand. Laura's fingers tightened slightly, like she was anchoring herself. "We need to be smarter than him," she said. Theodore's voice softened, almost painfully. "I'm trying." Laura looked up at him. "Then let me try with you." Theodore's throat moved. His gaze held hers for a long moment. Then he nodded. "All right," he said quietly, "with me." It happened 2 weeks later. Laura woke to a sound that didn't belong. Not wind, not house settling. A scrape, a soft thud, like a boot against wood. Her whole body went rigid. She slipped out of bed, moving soundlessly to the door. In the hall, a faint line of lamplight leaked from Theodore's room. He was awake too. Then she heard it again. Outside, near the barn, Laura's blood went ice cold. She moved down the hall and tapped lightly on Theodore's door. He opened it immediately, already dressed, already holding a rifle. His eyes met hers. "Stay behind me," he whispered. Laura's hands shook as she picked up the revolver Nettie had given her. She hated the weight of it, the cold certainty. They stepped onto the porch. The night was bright with moonlight. The barn door stood partly open. Theodore held up a hand, signaling her to stop. He moved forward quietly, each step careful. Laura followed, heart pounding so hard it hurt. A shadow moved inside the barn. Theodore lifted the rifle. "Come out," he called, voice steady. Silence. Then a low laugh drifted out. A man stepped into the moonlight, hands raised slightly. He wasn't Crowder. He wasn't anyone Laura recognized from town. But he had that same city sharpness in his eyes. "Evening," the man said pleasantly. "Didn't mean to wake anyone." Laura's stomach dropped. Theodore's rifle didn't waver. "Who are you?" The man smiled. "Name's Gideon Hart." Laura's breath caught. Theodore's body went rigid. Hart's eyes flicked to Laura, and his smile widened just slightly. "There you are." Laura couldn't breathe. Theodore's voice went deadly quiet. "You know her?" Hart's gaze stayed on Laura. "We've been looking." Laura's hands shook so badly she thought she might drop the revolver. Hart took a step forward. Theodore's rifle tracked him. "Easy," Hart said, still smiling. "No need for this to get messy." Theodore's voice was cold. "Too late." Hart sighed as if disappointed. "Miss Whitcombe?" The name hit Laura like a slap. Theodore's head snapped toward her, shock flaring across his face. Laura felt her throat close, tears burned her eyes. She couldn't even deny it. "Not now." Hart smiled at Theodore. "She didn't tell you her real name, did she?" Theodore's face went hard, but he didn't lower the rifle. "Doesn't matter." Hart chuckled. "Oh, it matters. She's got something my associates want back." Laura's voice came out thin. "I don't have anything." Hart's eyes were bright with amusement. "You have your memory." "That'll do." Theodore's jaw clenched. "You're not taking her." Hart's smile faded slightly. "You're a rancher, son. Don't die over someone else's trouble." Theodore's voice was steady. "She's not someone else." For a second, Hart looked genuinely surprised. Then his expression hardened. Behind him, another shadow moved. Laura saw it too late. A second man stepped out of the barn, gun raised. Theodore shifted instantly, pushing Laura back with his free hand. A shot cracked the night. Laura screamed, stumbling. Theodore fired. The second man dropped with a grunt, collapsing into the dirt. Hart swore and lunged toward Theodore. Laura raised the revolver with shaking hands and pulled the trigger. The kick jolted up her arm. The sound split the air. Hart jerked, stumbling back, not hit hard enough to drop, but enough to make him retreat. He glared at Laura, eyes now cold and murderous. "Well," he snarled, "you've learned something." Theodore stepped forward, rifle leveled. "Get off my land." Hart backed away slowly, gaze locked on Laura. "This isn't over," he said. "You can't hide in Kansas forever." Then he turned and ran into the dark. The night went still except for Laura's ragged breathing and the faint groan of the man on the ground. Theodore moved fast to the fallen man, checking him, then looked up sharply. "Go inside, lock the door." Laura's legs felt like water. "Theodore, now!" Laura stumbled back to the house, locked the door, and pressed her forehead against it as if she could hold the world out by force. She heard Theodore outside, heard him shout, heard hoofbeats as he rode hard toward town for the sheriff. Laura sank to the floor shaking. She'd fired a gun at a man. She'd watched another man fall. Her stomach heaved. She swallowed hard, eyes burning. Minutes felt like hours. When Theodore finally returned with Sheriff Harlan and 2 deputies, Laura stood at the window, trembling, watching lantern light move across the yard like cautious fireflies. Harlan entered the house without knocking, eyes sharp. "Where is she?" he demanded. Theodore stepped in behind him. His face was pale, jaw clenched. Laura stood slowly, forcing herself upright. Harlan's gaze flicked over her, then to Theodore. "She all right?" Theodore's eyes locked on Laura. "Are you?" Laura swallowed. "I don't know." Harlan exhaled hard. "All right, here's what's going to happen. We will say take the body. We'll track as best we can, but you need to understand, this means you're in it now, Blackstone." Theodore's voice was flat. "I was in it the moment they stepped onto my land." Harlan studied him, then nodded once, grim approval. When the deputies left, Theodore stood in the kitchen, hands braced on the table like he was holding himself together by force. Laura's throat tightened. "Theodore?" He didn't look up. "He said your name." Laura closed her eyes. "Yes." Theodore's voice went rough. "Is that really?" "Yes," she whispered. "Laura Whitcombe." Silence. Then Theodore straightened slowly and faced her. His eyes were dark, hurt flickering through them. "You lied," he said, quiet. Laura's chest hurt. "I had to." Theodore's jaw flexed. "I told you the truth about me." Laura's eyes filled. "I know." Theodore took a step closer. "Were you ever going to tell me?" Laura swallowed, voice breaking. "Yes. I was scared. I didn't want you to look at me differently." Theodore's gaze softened slightly, despite himself. "I look at you and see a woman who stood her ground and fired when it mattered." Laura's breath hitched. He stopped a few feet away, not touching her, but close enough she could feel him. "I'm angry," he admitted. Laura nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "You have every right." Theodore's throat moved. "But I'm also glad you're here." Laura let out a shaky laugh through tears. "That's a terrible combination." Theodore's mouth twitched. "Yeah." He reached up slowly like he was asking permission without words and brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb. Laura went still. Theodore's voice dropped. "Those men, they're not going to stop." Laura's voice was small. "I know." Theodore's gaze held hers, fierce and gentle at once. "Then neither will we." Laura's breath caught. "We?" Theodore nodded once. "We." Something in Laura cracked open then. Something she'd kept locked up since Boston. She stepped forward and pressed her forehead against his chest, trembling. Theodore froze for a second, then his arms came around her carefully, like she was something precious and breakable. Laura gripped his shirt, sobbing quietly. Theodore held her like he meant it. After a long moment, he murmured into her hair, "You're safe tonight." Laura clung tighter. "What about tomorrow?" Theodore's voice was steady, even as his arms tightened. "Tomorrow we fight smarter." Laura pulled back just enough to look up at him. His eyes were fierce, but there was tenderness in them too, something she'd been afraid to hope for. "Theodore," she whispered, voice shaking, "I don't want to be your burden." Theodore's hand cupped her cheek. "You're not." Laura's lips trembled. "Then what am I?" Theodore stared at her for a long moment, like he was making a decision. Then he leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't a polite kiss. It wasn't practiced. It was the kiss of someone who'd been lonely too long and finally found something worth reaching for. Laura's breath hitched, then she kissed him back, hands sliding up to his shoulders, holding on as if she might fall otherwise. When they broke apart, Theodore rested his forehead against hers. "We'll talk about the rest later," he murmured. "Right now, I just need you to be here." Laura nodded, voice barely there. "I'm here." And for the first time since she'd fled Boston under an assumed name, Laura Whitcombe believed she might actually survive what was coming. Not alone, not anymore. The next morning, Sheriff Harlan returned with Nettie Caldwell. Laura heard the wagon before she saw it, the rattle of wheels, the soft clop of a tired horse. She stood at the kitchen window, arms wrapped around herself, watching Theodore step onto the porch. He looked like he hadn't slept. His face was shaved, but his eyes were rough around the edges. like he'd spent the night staring down tomorrow. When Nettie climbed down, she didn't wait to be invited. She marched straight up the steps and into the house as if she owned it. Laura's throat tightened. Nettie! Nettie grabbed her by both shoulders and looked her square in the face. Are you hurt? Laura shook her head, blinking hard. No! Nettie's eyes narrowed. Did you shoot somebody? Laura's cheeks went hot with shame and shock. I fired. Nettie made a sound that was half a sigh, half a curse. Then she pulled Laura into a fierce hug. Laura stiffened at first. Then she crumpled, pressing her face into Nettie's shoulder like she'd been waiting for someone to hold her together. Nettie held on tight. All right, she muttered. All right, don't you go falling apart now. Not yet. Behind them, Sheriff Harlan cleared his throat. Theodore stood near the doorframe, watching with a guarded expression that Laura couldn't quite read. When Nettie finally let Laura go, she turned on Theodore like a storm. And you, she said, jabbing a finger at his chest, you think you can handle this alone? Theodore's jaw tightened. I'm not alone. Nettie looked between him and Laura, then huffed. Good, because if you try that stubborn nonsense, I'll tan your hide myself. Harlan shut the door, serious now. We need to talk. They sat at the kitchen table. Nettie poured coffee like she was arming them. Harlan looked at Laura. You remember the name Gideon Hart? Laura nodded, throat tight. Yes. Then we treat that like a thread, Harlan said. We pull until something unravels. Nettie's gaze sharpened. What about the dead man? Harlan's expression went grim. We buried him in the pauper ground. No papers on him. No one in town recognized him. That tells me he didn't plan on being recognized. Laura swallowed. So, they'll send more. Harlan nodded. Most likely. Theodore's hands clenched around his mug. Then we need to keep them off the ranch. Harlan shook his head. You can't just hide. Hiding makes you a cornered animal. Cornered animals get killed. Laura's stomach twisted. What do we do? Harlan leaned forward. We make you harder to grab. We make your story something the town knows. And we get evidence. Nettie frowned. Evidence how? She didn't copy anything? Laura's fingers curled in her lap. I remember the ledger patterns. I remember dates, warehouses, names. Harlan nodded. Then we start there. You write down everything you can remember. Every name, every place, every odd detail. Don't worry about order. Nettie pointed her mug at Laura. And you eat. You sleep. You keep breathing. You don't get to die on my watch. Laura tried to smile. It came out shaky. Yes, Nettie. Theodore looked at Nettie. Why are you here? Nettie's eyes flashed. Because you two are acting like the world is you and a gun. And it's not. She jerked her chin toward Harlan. This town has teeth if it wants to, but folks don't bite for strangers. Laura's stomach tightened. Nettie's voice softened, but only a little. So we make you not strangers. Theodore's gaze dropped to the table. I'm not good at people, Nettie supplied. Yes, I know. You've been grieving so long you made it your whole personality. Theodore's face tightened. Nettie, she leaned closer. Listen to me, Theodore Blackstone. Your parents would haunt you for letting this ranch die because you were too proud to ask for help. Theodore went still. His throat worked like he was swallowing something too big. Laura watched him, feeling a strange tenderness. She'd never met his parents, but she could see them in him. The steadiness, the stubborn devotion. Harlan stood. I'll post a deputy near the ranch for a few nights. But you're still going to make friends. You're going to show your face in town, both of you. Laura's stomach flipped. That's dangerous. It is, Harlan agreed, but it's also protection. Predators like quiet corners. They don't like crowds watching. Nettie nodded. And you'll come to supper at my place Sundays. People will see you. They'll ask questions. You'll smile and answer what you can without telling your whole soul. Laura glanced at Theodore. He looked like he was being asked to walk into a fire, but he nodded once, slow. All right. Nettie slapped the table. Good. Then she looked at Laura again, eyes sharp and kind. And you, Miss Whitcombe. Laura stiffened at her true name. Nettie held her gaze. No more running without telling me first. If you run again, I'm coming after you, and I'll drag you back by the ear. A laugh broke out of Laura before she could stop it. It startled her. The sound. Like her body remembered joy even if her mind didn't. Nettie's mouth softened. There! That's better. Theodore's eyes flicked to Laura's eyes and something warm moved through them. Laura looked down fast, heart beating too hard. Laura spent the next 2 days writing. She wrote at the kitchen table with a pencil that wore down to a stub. She wrote names until her hand cramped. She wrote dates and ports in the shape of certain signatures, the odd flourish a man used when he approved a shipment. She wrote the smell of the office too, because sometimes memory clung to scent better than ink. Theodore sat with her at night, watching her work like he was afraid she might vanish if he blinked. Sometimes she stopped and pressed her fingers to her temple, eyes squeezed shut. Theodore would slide a mug of coffee toward her. Quiet, patient. Tell me about Boston, he said one night. Laura's pencil paused. Wait a ball. Theodore shrugged, gaze fixed on the paper. Because you're here, but part of you is still there, like you're holding your breath. Laura swallowed. Boston isn't, it's not all bad. Theodore glanced at her, skeptical. Laura almost smiled. It's loud. It smells like salt and smoke. There are shops with glass windows full of things people don't need, and there are carriages and shouting and music spilling out of open doors. Theodore listened, expression unreadable. Laura's voice softened. When I was little, my mother used to take me to the harbor. We'd watch the ships. She'd tell me where they came from. She'd make up stories for the sailors, like they were heroes. Theodore's eyes stayed on her face now. Your mother sounds good. Laura nodded, throat tight. She was. She just got smaller. Over time. Theodore's jaw tightened. Your father did that? Laura hesitated. He didn't hit her. He didn't shout. He just made the world feel like it belonged to him, like we were guests in it. Theodore's hands clenched. Laura looked down, forcing herself to keep writing. What about you? Where were you born? Theodore leaned back in his chair, eyes distant. Here, on this land. My parents came from Missouri before I was born. My father wanted space, said Missouri was getting crowded. Laura smiled faintly. Crowded. Theodore's mouth twitched. That's what he said. He was quiet for a moment, then added, My mother wanted a garden. She wanted fruit trees. She said she'd make the prairie obey her if she had to. Laura's chest warmed. Did she? Theodore's gaze dropped. She got 2 apple trees to live. They're scrawny, but they bear. Laura looked up. Show me tomorrow. He blinked, like the request surprised him. Then he nodded. All right. The next day he took her out back of the house, behind a windbreak of scraggly cottonwoods, where 2 small apple trees stood, stubborn and alive. They look like fighters, Laura murmured. Theodore's voice was quiet. Yeah. He reached up and touched a branch gently. The tenderness of it made Laura's throat tighten. They were her pride, he said. After my father died, she'd sit out here wrapped in a blanket, like if she watched the trees hard enough, she could keep the rest of the world from taking more. Laura's stomach turned with empathy. And when she got sick? Theodore's jaw flexed. I tried everything. I rode to town in a blizzard to get medicine. The doctor said it was too late. Laura's eyes burned. I'm sorry. Theodore didn't look at her. I was angry for a long time, at winter, at myself. Laura stepped closer, voice gentle. Are you still? Theodore's eyes flicked to her. Not like before. He hesitated. Sometimes I think, if I'd been smarter, better, faster. Laura shook her head. You were 17. Theodore's mouth tightened. Doesn't matter. I was still the one who stayed alive. Laura swallowed hard. She understood that guilt. Survivors carried it like a second spine. She touched his sleeve lightly. Staying alive isn't a crime. Theodore stared down at her hand, then back at her face. His voice was rough. Feels like one some days. Laura's chest ached. Then we'll make it feel like something else. Theodore's gaze held hers for a long moment. Then he nodded once, slow. Okay, he said quietly. We'll try. Nettie's Sunday supper was an event, whether you wanted it to be or not. Theodore looked like he'd rather face a stampede than a room full of people who expected conversation. He combed his hair twice and still looked dissatisfied with it. You look fine, Laura said, smoothing her own borrowed dress. Theodore glanced at her and went still for a beat. His eyes flickered away quickly, like looking too long would make him say something reckless. You sure? He asked. voice low. Laura's heart thudded. Yes. They arrived at Nettie's boarding house to find the dining room crowded. Men with sun-cracked hands, women in aprons, a few children darting between chairs until Nettie snapped at them. The air smelled like roast chicken, bread, and gossip. Mr. Griggs was there, already red-faced from talking too much. Sheriff Harlan sat near the back, watching the room like it was his job to keep the peace even at supper. When Laura entered, heads turned. She fought the instinct to shrink. Theodore's hand brushed her lower back briefly, steadying her without making a show of it. It made her want to lean into him like a fool. Nettie clapped her hands. Sit, both of you, and if anyone makes this girl uncomfortable, I'll throw you out so hard you'll bounce. A few people chuckled. The tension eased. Laura sat beside Theodore at a long table. Across from them was a woman with dark hair pinned back tight and eyes that looked like she'd seen everything. I'm May Larkin, she said blunt. My husband runs cattle north of Blackstone's place. Laura nodded. Laura. May's gaze sharpened slightly at the lack of a last name, but she didn't press. You any good with a rifle? Laura's cheeks warmed. I shot at someone. May's brows rose. Hit? Laura's throat tightened. Not sure. May studied her, then nodded once, approval like a stamp. Good, world's not gentle. Theodore stiffened beside Laura like May's bluntness hit too close to his nerves. Mr. Griggs leaned in from down the table. I hear you gave Hollis a scare, he told Laura, grinning. Didn't think anyone could make that man blink? Laura forced a small smile. I just asked questions. Griggs laughed. That's how you do it. Questions are sharper than knives. Harlan's eyes flicked up, thoughtful, like he agreed more than he liked. As the meal went on, people asked Theodore about his ranch, about rain, about the price of feed, about whether he'd heard of a wolf sighting near the creek. Theodore answered in short sentences at first. Then as May Larkin challenged him on fencing, and Griggs teased him about being married to silence, Theodore's shoulders loosened a fraction. Laura watched him amazed, not because he suddenly became social, but because he stayed in the room. He didn't retreat into himself. After dessert, Nettie cornered Laura near the kitchen. You doing all right? She asked, wiping her hands. Laura nodded. Yes. Nettie studied her face. And Theodore? Laura hesitated. He's trying. Nettie snored. That boy's been trying for years. He just needed someone to try with him. Laura's cheeks warmed. Nettie narrowed her eyes. Don't you blush at me. I'm old, not blind. Laura nearly laughed. Nettie! Nettie softened slightly. He cares about you. Laura's throat tightened. I care about him. Nettie nodded like she'd already known. Good. Then you'll both have something worth fighting for. Laura swallowed hard. Nettie, what if my trouble ruins him? Nettie's eyes went hard. Your trouble didn't create the kind of men who ruin people. Don't you carry their sin like it's your suitcase? Laura blinked fast. Okay. Nettie leaned closer. Besides, Theodore's ranch was already under attack. Crowder, Hollis, all of it. You just brought the storm into view. Laura exhaled, shaky. Nettie patted her cheek, brisk. Now go back out there. Let folks see your face. Let them decide you belong. Laura stepped back into the dining room and found Theodore near the window, talking quietly with Sheriff Harlan. Theodore glanced at her, and his expression softened, just slightly, like he'd been looking for her. Laura walked to him. Harlan looked between them. Blackstone, walk her home when you leave. Theodore's voice was steady. I will. Harlan's gaze flicked to Laura. And you. If anything feels wrong, you come straight to my office. You don't wait to be polite. Laura nodded. Yes, Sheriff. When they finally left, the night was cold and clear, stars like pinpricks in black velvet. They walked slowly, side by side. Theodore's hands were shoved in his coat pockets. You did good, he said. Laura blinked. I just ate chicken. Theodore's mouth twitched. No, you stayed. You talked. You didn't flinch when folks looked. Laura's throat tightened. I wanted to. I still want to. Theodore nodded, quiet. Yeah, me too. They walked in silence for a while, boots crunching on frost. Then Theodore said softly, when I saw you in that dining room, it felt like the house wasn't the only place you existed anymore. Laura's breath caught at the careful tenderness of it. I'm trying, she whispered. Theodore's voice went rough. Me too. His hand brushed hers, tentative. Laura's fingers twined with his without thinking. Theodore went still for half a second, then squeezed gently, like he was confirming she was real. They walked the rest of the way like that. Trouble didn't wait for comfort to settle. 2 days after Sunday supper, Theodore rode into town to pay the adjusted bank amount Laura had calculated. He came back with his jaw clenched so hard it looked painful. Hollis refused it, Theodore said flatly. Laura's blood went cold. Refused? Said the bank reassessed risk. Said they're calling the whole loan due in 60 days. Laura's stomach dropped. He can't. He can, Theodore said, voice tight. Not legally fair, but he can. Laura's fingers clenched. Why now? Theodore's eyes were dark. Because you embarrassed him. Because Crowder wants the pasture. Because someone told Hollis I've got trouble sniffing around my land. Laura swallowed. Crowder. Theodore nodded once. Crowder. Laura paced, mind racing. We need leverage. Proof he's breaking contract terms. Theodore cut in, voice rough. Even if we prove it, courts take time. Laura stopped, chest heaving. Then we need money. Theodore's face tightened. We don't have it. Laura stared at the ledger, heart hammering. We can sell cattle? The herd's already thin, Theodore snapped, then immediately looked like he regretted the sharpness. Sorry, Laura swallowed. It's all right. Theodore dragged a hand through his hair. I'm just tired of feeling like no matter what I do, someone's got their boot on my throat. Laura's throat tightened. Then we step on their foot. Theodore looked at her, startled. Laura forced herself to breathe. We need allies. We need to make this public. If Hollis looks like he's collaborating with Crowder, he'll get nervous. Theodore's mouth tightened. Folks don't like going against the bank. Laura's eyes hardened. Folks don't like being cheated either. That night, Laura rode with Theodore to May Larkin's place. May listened while Laura explained the loan terms and the sudden call due. Her husband Tom sat quiet, chewing the inside of his cheek. May's eyes narrowed. Hollis is squeezing you because Crowder told him to. Tom grunted. Crowder's been buying up land like a hungry dog. May leaned forward. What's your plan? Laura swallowed, then said it. We need a cooperative loan. Ranchers, pooled. Enough to cover Theodore's call due so Hollis can't steal the ranch. Tom blinked. A pooled fund? May's eyes sharpened, like mutual aid. Laura nodded, heart pounding. Yes. If Theodore falls, Crowder's stronger. If Crowder's stronger, he'll come for the next ranch. May sat back, thinking. Tom scratched his jaw. That's risky. May shot him a look. So is starving one by one. May looked at Theodore then. You willing to swallow pride and ask? Theodore's jaw flexed. He looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Then he nodded once. Yes. Laura's chest warmed. Pride didn't vanish in a day, but watching Theodore bend it for his survival felt like witnessing a miracle. May nodded. All right. We'll talk to a few folks. Quiet at first. See who bites. Laura exhaled, shaky. Thank you. May's gaze flicked to Laura. What are they really hunting you for, girl? Laura's stomach tightened. Theodore's voice was low. That's her business. May studied him, then nodded slowly. Fair, but if your trouble brings bullets, I want to know what I'm standing in. Laura forced herself to speak. I saw names. Smuggling. Men who kill to keep it quiet. May's expression hardened. All right, she said simply. Then we don't let them take you. On the ride home, Theodore was quiet. Finally, he said, You're brave. Laura laughed bitterly. I'm scared every moment. Theodore glanced at her. Brave isn't the absence of fear. My father used to say that. Laura's chest tightened. He sounds like a good man. Theodore's voice went soft. He was. He just didn't get enough time. Laura hesitated. I'm glad you stayed. Theodore's gaze stayed forward. Sometimes I hate that I did. Laura's throat tightened. And now? Theodore's jaw worked. Then he said quietly, Now I'm less sure. Less sure he hated it. Laura's heart kicked hard. They rode in silence, the kind that felt like something growing rather than something empty. A week later, a letter arrived at Nettie's boarding house. Nettie brought it out to the ranch herself, like she didn't trust anyone else to touch it. Laura saw the unfamiliar handwriting and felt her stomach drop. Her hand shook as she opened it. Inside was a short note, written in Edwin Marsh's careful script. Miss Whitcombe, they came to my office. They were polite until they weren't. They asked about you. They implied I would be responsible for any trouble you caused by forgetting your place. I told them nothing that mattered. I told them you were dead. They did not believe me. Please be careful. Please do not come back. There are eyes on the harbor and names that reach farther than you think. E. Marsh. Laura read it twice, vision blurring. Theodore watched her face change. What is it? Laura handed him the letter with trembling fingers. He read it, jaw tightening with every line. When he looked up, his eyes were dark and furious. They threatened him. Laura's voice cracked. He helped me anyway. Theodore's hands tightened on the paper until it creased. Then he forced himself to loosen, like he was afraid of breaking the only proof of kindness she'd brought with her. Laura's throat closed. I did this. Theodore's voice went rough. No, you didn't. Laura's tears slipped free. He lied for me. He put himself in danger. Theodore stood and paced once like contained violence. Then we ended. Laura's breath hitched. How? Theodore stopped in front of her. We make your memory into something written. Something that can't be buried with you. Laura stared at him. Theodore's voice was steady now, as if the decision had snapped something into place. We send it to federal men. Marsh might know someone, or Harlan does, or Nettie does, Laura whispered suddenly. Theodore blinked. Laura wiped tears with the back of her hand. Nettie knows everyone. She hears everything. Theodore nodded once. Then we ask. That night, Nettie sat at Theodore's table, reading Marsh's letter with a grim face. When she finished, she tapped the paper once. All right. Laura's throat tightened. You can help? Nettie looked at Laura, eyes fierce. Honey, I've been poor, widowed, and underestimated. I can help. Theodore asked quietly, How? Nettie leaned back. There's a man in Topeka, a newspaper man. Owes me for, well, he owes me. Laura's stomach flipped. A newspaper? Nettie nodded. If those men are doing what you think they're doing, they're not just hurting individuals. They're part of a web. You get the web into the daylight, it starts a tear. Theodore's jaw tightened. And it paints a target on us. Nettie's expression didn't soften. You already have a target, Theodore. Better to have it while people are watching. Laura swallowed hard. What do we send? Nettie looked at Laura. Everything you wrote, names, dates, ports, and Marsh's letter copied. Not original. Laura nodded, fear and relief twisting together. Theodore's voice was low. If we do this, there's no going back. Laura met his gaze. I don't want to go back. Theodore's throat moved. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Nettie pretended not to notice, but Laura saw the tiny satisfied twitch at the corner of her mouth. All right, Nettie said briskly. Tomorrow we make copies. Then I'll take it. Laura's breath caught. You'll go? Nettie snorted. I can travel without looking like a frightened rabbit, and if anyone tries to bother me, I'll bite their fingers off. Theodore's mouth twitched. I believe you. Laura laughed shakily, and it felt like grabbing onto a rope while falling. They didn't wait for Nettie to leave to get hit again. 2 nights later, Theodore woke Laura with a soft knock on her door. Laura, he whispered, get dressed. Quiet. Her heart slammed. What is it? The south pasture fence is down, he said, and the cattle are spooked. Laura grabbed her coat, hands shaking. They hurried outside into cold darkness. Moonlight gleamed on frost. The wind cut like a knife. In the distance, cattle bellowed. Theodore ran, Laura stumbling after him, lantern swinging. When they reached the fence line, Laura's stomach dropped. The fence hadn't just fallen. It had been cut. Clean through. Theodore's face went hard. Crowder. Laura's breath came out in a cloud. He's forcing you to lose herd value. Theodore didn't answer. He was already moving, shouting and clapping, guiding cattle back in the dark. Laura helped, voice raw from yelling. Her hands froze. Her feet slipped in the grass. At one point, a steer bolted toward the open gap, and Laura stepped in its path, waving the lantern wildly. Theodore grabbed her waist and yanked her back just in time. The steer thundered past. Laura's heart hammered as Theodore held her, his grip tight. What were you thinking? He snapped, fear leaking through anger. Laura's voice shook. I was thinking we can't lose them. Theodore stared at her, breathing hard. then pulled her closer for a second, forehead almost touching hers. "Don't do that again," he said, voice rough. "Don't throw yourself at 1,000 pounds of muscle because you're trying to prove something." Laura swallowed. "I'm not trying to prove," Theodore cut in, quieter now. "I can't lose you." The words hit her like a punch. Laura's breath caught. "Theodore," his jaw flexed like he'd said too much. Then he let her go abruptly and went back to the fence. They worked until dawn. By the time the sun rose pale and cold, the cattle were contained again, but exhaustion sat heavy in Laura's bones. Theodore stared at the cut fence posts, eyes dark. "They're escalating," Laura whispered. Theodore's voice was flat. "So are we." When they rode into town later that morning to report the sabotage, they found Sheriff Harlan already waiting, face grim. "You're not the only one, Harlan said. Theodore's stomach tightened. "Who else?" "Larkin's north fence was cut," Harlan said, "and Griggs had his storehouse broken into. Nothing big stolen, just a message." Laura's blood ran cold. "What message?" Harlan looked at Laura. "A shipping receipt. Old. From Boston." Laura went numb. Theodore's hand tightened on her arm. "They're telling her they can reach anywhere." Harlan nodded. "And they're telling me they know what I'm sniffing at." May Larkin stepped out of the sheriff's office then, face like stone. She looked at Laura and Theodore. "We're holding a meeting tonight." Theodore's jaw tightened. "That's dangerous." May's eyes flashed. "So is getting picked off. We either stand together or we fall separate." Laura's chest tightened. Standing together. Roots. Teeth. She glanced at Theodore. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "All right." That night, ranchers gathered in the back room of Nettie's boarding house. It smelled like coffee and tension. Tom Larkin stood with his hat in his hands, face serious. Mr. Griggs looked paler than usual, mouth tight. When Theodore spoke, his voice was low but steady. "My loan's been called due," he said, "and my fence was cut. I think Crowder's behind it." Griggs muttered, "That's Snake." Theodore continued, "And there are men hunting Laura." Heads turned. Laura fought the urge to shrink. She lifted her chin. May spoke before anyone else could. "She's not the threat. The men chasing her are." A murmur ran through the room. Harlan stepped forward. "I won't lie, this could get ugly. But if you let Crowder and his kind buy you one piece at a time, your children will work land they don't own." Silence. Then an older rancher spoke, voice rough. "What are you asking?" Laura stood, hands shaking. "A pooled loan," she said. "Temporary. Enough to stop the bank from swallowing Theodore's ranch, and enough to show Crowder the town is watching." A man scoffed. "And if Crowder comes after us?" May's voice was sharp. "He already is." Griggs cleared his throat. "I've been selling on credit to half of you. You know I don't like risk. But I'll tell you something." He looked around the room. "If those bastards are cutting fences and prowling at night, then we ain't dealing with business. We're dealing with intimidation." A few nods. Tom Larkin exhaled. "I'll put in." May looked at him, surprised. He shrugged. "I'm tired of being scared." One by one, others agreed, not all, but enough. Laura's vision blurred with relief. Theodore stood still, like he didn't know what to do with people helping him. Then he spoke, voice rough. "I'll pay every cent back." May snorted. "You better. I like my money." A few chuckles broke the tension. Later, when the room emptied, Theodore stood in the doorway, staring at the street as if it wasn't real. Laura stepped beside him. "They helped you." Theodore's voice was quiet. "Yeah." Laura's throat tightened. "You let them." He glanced at her, eyes dark. "Because you told me to stop letting people eat me alive." Laura almost smiled. "I did." Theodore looked at her for a long moment, then said softly, "You've changed this place." Laura's breath caught. "So have you." He hesitated, then took her hand again, like it was becoming his habit. Laura held on. 2 days after the meeting, Crowder came again. This time he didn't smile. He rode up with 2 men behind him and stopped at the edge of the yard like he didn't want to step onto Theodore's land without force. Theodore stood on the porch, rifle in hand, but pointed down. Laura stood inside the doorway, heart hammering. Crowder called, "Blackstone." Theodore didn't move. "Crowder." Crowder's eyes cut to the doorway. "Miss Hale," when he said, too smooth, "or whatever name you're using today." Laura went cold. Theodore's jaw clenched. Say what you came to say. Crowder lifted a folded paper. I hear the town is pooling money to save you. Theodore's eyes narrowed. Crowder's voice was low and poisonous. That's touching. Community spirit. Makes me want to weep. Theodore's voice was steady. Get to it. Crowder smiled without warmth. All right, here's my new offer. He held up the paper. You sign over the South pasture at a fair price. I take your debt. In exchange, his gaze slid to Laura. I make sure those men from back east stop sniffing around. Laura's stomach dropped. You know them. Crowder's smile widened slightly. I know a lot of men. Theodore's voice went deadly quiet. You're offering to trade her. Crowder shrugged. I'm offering you peace. Theodore's hands tightened on the rifle. Get off my land. Crowder's eyes hardened. Think carefully, boy. You can't fight every hungry wolf. Sometimes you toss one chunk of meat so the rest of the herd survives. Theodore went still. Laura's throat closed. She took a step forward, voice shaking. Theodore, don't. Crowder's gaze locked on her. You're not worth a ranch, he said softly. Not in the real world. Laura felt something snap inside her, and she'd been told her value her entire life by men who thought they owned it. Her voice steadied. Then it's a good thing I'm not living in your world. Crowder's smile disappeared. Theodore's voice was rough. Leave. Crowder's eyes stayed on Laura. You'll regret making yourself inconvenient. Then he looked at Theodore and his voice went cold. 60 days. After that, your land becomes mine one way or another. He turned his horse and rode off. Laura realized she'd been holding her breath. She exhaled shakily. Theodore stood very still. Then he stepped inside and shut the door, locking it with a hard click. Laura's voice trembled. He's working with them. Theodore's jaw clenched. Yeah. Laura swallowed. You heard what he said. Theodore's eyes were dark, fierce. I did. Laura's chest tightened. I don't want you to lose everything because of me. Theodore took 2 steps toward her, voice rough. Stop saying that. Laura blinked, startled. Theodore's hands clenched at his sides. You're not a storm. You're not a curse. You're a person. Laura's throat tightened. Theodore? He cut in, quieter but sharper. My ranch was dying before you got here. You're not the thing ruining it. You're the reason I finally learned how to fight for it. Laura's eyes filled. Theodore's voice cracked slightly. And I'm not trading you like your cattle. Laura let out a small, broken laugh through tears. That might be the first time anyone has ever said something like that to me. Theodore's face softened. He stepped closer, and his hands came up slowly, like he was afraid she'd flinch. He cupped her face gently. You're not going anywhere, he whispered. Not unless you choose it. Laura leaned into his hands, eyes closed, breath shaking. Then she whispered the truth she'd been holding like a live coal. I don't want to choose it. Theodore's forehead rested against hers. Good. He kissed her again, slower this time, like he was promising something without words. When they broke apart, Theodore's eyes were steady. We end this, he said. Laura's stomach flipped. How? Theodore's gaze went hard. We give Harlan and that newspaper man enough to bring the law down on Crowder and his friends. Laura swallowed. And if the law doesn't come fast enough? Theodore's voice went low. Then we hold the line until it does. Nettie left for Topeka at dawn, carrying copies of Laura's pages wrapped in oilcloth like sacred text. Before she climbed into the wagon, she looked at Laura with fierce tenderness. You did something brave, Nettie said. Laura's throat tightened. I just remembered. Nettie shook her head. No, you stopped hiding your memory like it was shame. She looked at Theodore next. And you, she said, pointing, don't you die. I will never forgive you. Theodore's mouth twitched. Yes, ma'am, Nettie snorted. Damn right. After she left, the ranch felt too quiet again. Theodore and Laura moved through chores like they were fortifying a fortress. They checked fences. They kept rifles close. They slept in shifts without naming it. On the 3rd day, Sheriff Harlan arrived with a stranger in a dark coat and a hat that looked too clean for Kansas. He introduced himself as Deputy Marshal Collins. Laura's pulse spiked. Federal. Collins spoke plainly. We got a packet from a woman named Nettie Caldwell and a follow-up letter from a man in Boston. Laura's breath caught. Mr. Marsh. Collins nodded. He corroborated parts of your account, enough that my office is interested. Theodore's jaw tightened. Interested enough to act? Collins's expression was cool. Interested enough to set a trap. Laura's stomach twisted. A trap how? Collins looked at her. They want your memory, your names. That means they'll come for you again. If we make them believe you're about to hand that memory to the wrong people, they'll move. Theodore's voice went cold. You're using her as bait. Collins held Theodore's gaze. I'm offering protection and a chance to finish this. You want to stop being hunted? This is how. Laura's throat tightened. Fear surged. Then something else rose underneath it. Exhaustion, anger, a fierce refusal to be a fleeing shadow forever. Laura spoke before Theodore could. I'll do it. Theodore turned sharply. Laura met his eyes. I can't keep running in circles. I want my name back. Theodore's face tightened with fear and love and rage all braided together. He looked like he wanted to argue. Then he swallowed it down. All right, he said, voice rough. But I'm with you. Collins nodded once. Good. The plan was simple and dangerous. Laura would go into town with Theodore. They would be seen. They would go to the telegraph office and send a message to an address Collins provided, implying she had names and would testify. Then they would wait. The waiting was the worst part. They sat in Nettie's boarding house parlor that evening, with Harlan, Collins, May, and Tom Larkin, pretending to be calm. Mr. Griggs hovered like a nervous rooster, muttering about locks and rifles and people these days. Laura sat beside Theodore on the settee. His hand rested over hers, thumb rubbing slow circles into her knuckles like a prayer. You all right? He murmured. Laura's voice was barely there. No, Theodore's mouth tightened. Me neither. Laura's breath trembled. If this goes wrong, Theodore turned toward her, eyes fierce. It won't. Laura wanted to believe him. She wanted to climb inside that certainty and live there. A knock sounded. Everybody in the room went still. Harlan rose, hand on his gun. Who is it? A voice from the hall, calm. Delivery. Harlan opened the door a crack. A boy stood there with a note. Harlan took it, shut the door, and opened the paper. His face went hard. What? May demanded. Harlan looked at Laura. They want to meet, tonight, at the old freight shed. Laura's stomach dropped. Theodore's grip tightened on her hand. No, he said flatly. That's too exposed. Collins shook his head. It's exactly where they'd choose, which means it's exactly where we can catch them. Laura's pulse roared in her ears. Theodore leaned closer to her, voice low. You don't have to do this. Laura looked at him. His eyes were dark, intense, terrified. And in them, she saw the boy who'd stayed at 17 because someone had to. She saw the man he was becoming, learning that someone didn't have to be alone. Laura swallowed hard. I'm tired of being afraid. Theodore's jaw flexed. Then he nodded once, like it hurt. All right. He lifted her hand to his mouth and pressed a brief kiss to her knuckles. Laura's breath caught. I'm right beside you, he whispered. Nettie's voice came sharp from the doorway. And I'm behind you with a frying pan if anyone survives long enough to need it. Laura startled, then laughed, startled by the sound of her own laughter in a moment like this. Nettie stepped into the room, eyes fierce. You think I'd miss this? Harlan groaned. Nettie, you were supposed to be in Topeka. Nettie sniffed. I was. Then I came back. Somebody's got to keep you idiots alive. The room tightened into readiness. And then they moved. Lanterns were kept low. Men spread out. Collins placed deputies on the freight shed roofline and behind stacked crates. Theodore stayed close to Laura, his presence steady and hot at her side. Laura's stomach churned as they walked into the night. The freight shed squatted at the edge of town, old and creaking, smelling of oil and dust and old shipments. The perfect place for secrets to feel at home. Laura stepped inside with Theodore, Harlan, and Collins, a few paces back in shadow. A figure moved near the far end of the shed. Gideon Hart. Laura's blood turned to ice. Hart smiled like they were meeting for tea. Miss Whitcombe. Theodore's body went rigid beside her. Laura forced her voice steady. You're late. Hart's eyebrows lifted, amused. You're braver than I expected. Laura's heart hammered. I'm tired. Hart's smile sharpened. Where are the names? Laura lifted her chin. Not here. Hart's gaze flicked, predatory. Then where? Before Laura could answer, another man stepped from behind a crate. Silas Crowder. Theodore's jaw clenched, rage flashing. Crowder's eyes gleamed. "There she is," he said softly, like savoring. "Told you I could smoke her out." Laura's stomach dropped, Crowder and Hart. Together, the town threat and the eastern threat braided into one rope. Crowder looked at Theodore. "You should have taken my deal." Theodore's voice was low and deadly. "Go to hell." Crowder chuckled. "Already there, boy. Just buying property." Hart stepped closer. "We don't have time. Bring her." Laura's skin crawled. Theodore shifted subtly, placing himself half in front of her. "No." Crowder's eyes hardened. He lifted a hand slightly. A third man appeared near the side door, gun in hand. Everything moved at once. Collins shouted, "Federal marshals, drop your weapons!" Gunfire erupted. Laura's mind went white with sound. She stumbled back as Theodore grabbed her waist and yanked her behind a support beam. Wood splintered near her head. Theodore shoved her down. "Stay!" he snapped. Laura's hands shook around the revolver, but she kept it close. She heard Hart curse, heard Crowder shout. Theodore fired, controlled, not wild. The sound vibrated through her bones. Laura peeked around the beam just long enough to see Hart running for the side door. If he got away, this never ended. She didn't think. She moved. She rose and aimed, hands trembling, breath locked in her throat. She fired. Hart stumbled, grabbing his shoulder, and crashed into a crate. He didn't get up. Laura's ears rang. Her hands went numb. Theodore turned, eyes wide with terror and awe. "Laura!" She stared at him, shaking. I didn't." Theodore grabbed her face, checking her. "Are you hit?" Laura shook her head, tears spilling. "No." Across the shed, Crowder tried to bolt. May Larkin appeared out of nowhere like a wrathful spirit and swung a piece of wood at his knees. Crowder went down with a howl. Harlan's deputy slapped cuffs on him while Nettie stood over him with a lantern, face viciously satisfied. "Thought you could own people," Nettie spat. "Look at you now." Crowder glared up at her. "You think this ends me?" Nettie leaned in close. "It ends you here." The shed filled with heavy breathing and the sharp smell of gun smoke. Collins strode forward, eyes scanning. "Everyone alive?" A chorus of shaken yeses. Theodore still held Laura's face. His hands were trembling now that the danger had passed. Laura's voice broke. "It's over?" Theodore's eyes were wet. I think it might be." Harlan approached, grim but relieved. "Crowder's done. Hart's alive but wounded. We got him. And with Marcia's letter and what you wrote, we've got enough to connect them." Laura sagged, shaking. Theodore pulled her into his arms so tight it almost hurt. Laura clung to him, sobbing silently into his shoulder, the fear finally draining out like water from a broken cup. Theodore's voice was raw in her hair. "You did it." Laura's words came out broken. I just wanted to stop running." Theodore's arms tightened. "You did." Outside, dawn began to pale the horizon. And for the first time, the light didn't feel like something to fear. It felt like a beginning. The town woke up different the morning after the freight shed. Word moved faster than the sun. By the time Laura and Theodore reached the ranch again, people already knew that Silas Crowder had been taken in chains. They knew there had been gunfire. They knew federal men were involved. They knew, in the way small towns always do, that something rotten had finally been dragged into the light. Laura stood on the porch, wrapped in Theodore's coat, watching frost melt off the grass. Her hands still shook if she thought too long about the night before. Theodore moved around the yard, checking gates, checking locks, checking on her without making it obvious. He did everything the same way he always had, but slower, like he was learning a new rhythm. When he came back inside, he set 2 mugs of coffee on the table and sat across from her. "You slept," he said. Laura nodded. "I dreamed I was back on the train." His jaw tightened. "Running?" She shook her head. "Sitting, just sitting and watching the land go by." Theodore let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "That sounds better." Laura studied his face. There were new lines there now, not age, knowledge. "You saved me," she said softly. Theodore shook his head. "You saved yourself." Laura swallowed them. "You didn't have to stand there." Theodore met her gaze. "I wanted to." That word, wanted, still startled her when it applied to anything that stayed. They drank their coffee in companionable quiet. Outside, the ranch breathed. The cattle moved slowly, peacefully, as if nothing had ever tried to break them apart. Laura rested her hand on the table, palm open. After a moment, Theodore covered it with his own. They stayed like that for a long time. Justice did not come quickly. It never did. But it came steadily. Hart survived his wound and talked once he realized how many doors were closing at once. Names led to names. Warehouses led to ledgers. Crowder's land acquisitions were traced back to intimidation, sabotage, and money laundered through shell companies with Eastern ties. Laura testified twice. The first time, her voice shook. The second time, it didn't. She stood in borrowed dresses with her hair pinned back and said her name clearly. Laura Whitcombe. Theodore sat behind her, close enough that she could feel his presence like a hand at her back. Some people stared, some whispered, but no one looked at her like prey. When it was over, when the final papers were signed and the marshals rode out with their prisoners, Laura stepped outside into clean air and felt something lift that she hadn't known she'd been carrying. Theodore met her on the courthouse steps. "It's done," she said. He nodded, eyes warm and tired. "Yeah, it is." She laughed then, sudden and bright, startling herself. "What?" he asked, smiling despite himself. "I just realized," she said breathless, "no one is looking for me anymore." Theodore's smile softened. "No, they're not." Laura hesitated, then said the words that felt like the true ending of the fight. "I'm home." Theodore's throat worked. He didn't answer right away. Then he said quietly, "Good." The pooled loan kept the ranch afloat. The bank backed down under scrutiny. Hollis resigned before he could be forced. New terms were drawn up. Fair ones. The south pasture stayed Blackstone land. Theodore worked harder than ever, but not alone anymore. Tom Larkin helped mend fences. May showed up with opinions and unsolicited advice. Mr. Griggs extended credit without interest until Theodore told him to stop being ridiculous. Laura managed the books openly now. No hiding, no shrinking. People came to her with questions. She answered them. One afternoon, while balancing figures at the table, she looked up to find Theodore watching her with a strange expression. "What?" she asked. He shook his head. "I just never thought I'd see someone at that table who wasn't fighting the numbers like they were snakes." Laura smiled. "They behave if you're firm." He laughed softly. "You do too." The work was still hard. The land didn't become kind just because justice had shown up once, but it became possible. And that changed everything. Peace, Laura learned, was unsettling at first. There were mornings she woke with her heart racing, sure something terrible had happened. There were nights Theodore woke from dreams of falling horses and snowstorms that never ended. They learned each other's silences. When Laura went quiet, Theodore didn't press. He made coffee. He stayed near. When Theodore grew distant, Laura touched his arm and asked simple questions that anchored him back into the present. They argued sometimes. About money, about when to replace a plow, about whether she should ride into town alone. But they argued honestly, and afterward they talked. One evening, sitting on the porch as the sky turned lavender, Theodore spoke without looking at her. "I never thought I'd marry." Laura's heart stumbled. "Oh." He glanced at her, nervous for the first time she'd ever seen him. "That wasn't, I didn't think anyone would want to build a life with a man who's already lived one lifetime alone." Laura's voice was gentle. "You don't live alone anymore." He studied her face. "Do you ever think about staying for good?" Laura didn't answer right away. She thought of Boston, of her mother's locket, now warm against her skin, of the ranch waking each morning, of Theodore's quiet steadiness. "Yes," she said. "I think about it all the time." Theodore exhaled, long and relieved. Theodore didn't ask with a ring or a speech. He asked on a cold morning when the apple trees were just beginning to bud. Laura stood with her sleeves rolled up, pruning carefully. Theodore handed her a cloth and watched her work for a minute too long. "You remember what you said about my mother's trees?" he asked. Laura smiled. "That they were fighters." "They are," he said, "and they bore fruit even when everything told them not to." Laura turned toward him. Theodore swallowed. "I want that. A life that bears fruit, even when it's hard." Her breath caught. He took her hands, rough and warm. "Laura Whitcombe, will you marry me?" She didn't hesitate. Yes, she said, voice breaking. Yes. He pulled her into his arms, forehead pressed to hers, both of them laughing softly like they'd surprised themselves with how right it felt. Nettie cried when she heard. May nodded once and said, Good, you'll need someone stubborn. Mr. Griggs tried to give a speech and was cut off. They married in late spring. The ceremony was simple. Nettie insisted on flowers. May insisted on practicality. Sheriff Harlan stood proudly in a clean shirt. Laura wore a plain dress she'd sewn herself from good fabric. Theodore wore his best coat, mended but dignified. When Laura walked toward him across the grass, Theodore's hands shook. You look, he began, then stopped, overwhelmed. Laura smiled. So do you. They spoke their vows quietly, honestly. No promises of ease, just promises of effort, of standing, of staying. When Theodore kissed her, the applause was rough and heartfelt. They danced afterward on uneven ground, laughter and music drifting into the open sky. That night, as husband and wife, they stood on the porch together. I kept my name, Laura said softly. Theodore nodded. Good. And I took yours, she added. His throat worked. Laura Blackstone? She smiled. I like it. Marriage didn't soften the land. The year after their wedding was dry, harder than anyone expected. Laura worried at night. Theodore carried the weight quietly. Then one morning, Laura sat at the table staring at nothing. Theodore noticed. You sick? He asked. She shook her head, hand drifting to her stomach. No. Understanding dawned slowly on his face. You? Laura nodded, tears in her eyes. I think so. Theodore sat down hard, then laughed, then covered his face with his hands. When he looked up, his eyes were bright. We'll figure it out. Laura laughed through tears. That's what you always say. And I always mean it, he replied. The drought broke late that summer. The apple trees bore more fruit than they ever had. Laura gave birth on a cool autumn night. Nettie was there. May was there. Theodore never left Laura's side, holding her hand like it was the only solid thing left in the world. When the baby cried, sharp and strong, Theodore sobbed openly. A daughter. They named her Clara. Theodore held her like she was made of light. She's real, he whispered, awed. Laura smiled weakly. She is. Months later, Laura stood on the porch with Clara bundled against her chest, watching Theodore teach their daughter how to hold onto his finger. The ranch stretched out before them, imperfect and alive. Laura pressed a kiss to Clara's head and felt something settle in her bones. She hadn't escaped her past. She had built a future. And when Theodore came to stand beside her, arm warm around her shoulders, Laura leaned into him without fear. Forever didn't arrive all at once. It came in days like this, quiet, hard-earned, home.